Hi, my name's Mike Hellberg, and as Sherry just said, I'm a professor here in the Department of Biological Sciences. And I'm going to tell you real quick, because that's how I talk, about a little bit about my research and what I do, and then a whole lot more about the process of applying for graduate school for any of you who might be interested, having seen all the exciting things I get to do as a scientist. Okay, so I'm a marine biologist. So one of the hats that I wear then is to say that I'm a marine biologist, and that's something that I only realized after I was married is a great thing to say at parties and bars. But the reason for that is that there's this great image of what marine biologists do, which is essentially that you go to these great exotic places. This is one of my graduate students, getting acclimated to where he's going to be doing his work. And then you jump underwater where you're greeted by friendly sea creatures like these Bahamian squid that are eyeing Ron suspiciously. Or you're out on land and you get to play with fun things like this sea hare my student Alice is playing with, or I'm poking at this manatee somewhere in Guyana. So you get to play with all these great sea animals. And then, you get to play around in boats and dash around. This is in a river in South America. This is poking around looking for snails in South Florida. And after a whole day of, and then you get to feed the animals. This is giving our watermelon scraps to some sea turtles off the coast of Ecuador. And then after all this, you're just zonked from doing all these things and spending the whole morning with fun animals, so you get to rest. And then you rest some more. And then you rest some more. And then you have drinks later in the afternoon. You talk about everything you've done. So that's basically the idea of what it looks like to be a marine biologist. And these are real life pictures taken of me and my students. So it does happen sometime. But the reality is somewhat different as far as why we do what we do and the way we actually spend our time. That is that while you're underwater and you do bump into some of these exciting animals, most of the time you're actually taking data in a way that you're so focused that you don't notice things that are going on around you. So I've had 7-foot sharks swim by me that I didn't see because I was looking at the 2-inch fish that we were working on. I was chipping off corals and was attacked by a sea otter that I didn't notice because you're focused on these little things right in front of you. This, for example, is this little fish that is shorter than your pinky that my student Ron there was working on and taking data down on. Then you have to do little kinds of manipulations. Sometimes it's a real hassle, especially if there's big currents and things like that, and you have to wait for weather to pass. And then sometimes, having done this work, you have to finish up this work. So these are some pictures my student, Ron, again, had collected these little fish that he worked on. We wanted to make sure we got pictures of their color patterns. Those go away once you preserve them. So we had to stay up till 2 in the morning preserving all the fish that we got that day before we could go out the next day to start doing it all over again. Also, not every place that we work on is exceptionally beautiful. This coast here, actually the western coast of the island of Trinidad, is very similar actually to the south coast of Louisiana, only it's got tar seeps. So when we were scooping up these clams here, you would have these bubbles where literally there'd be like these tar burps from these oil beds. And so you would randomly get spit up 3-foot geysers of tar and oil that could land in the boat and splash you, and it wasn't that pleasant. And then when the other reality is that we're not really spending most of our time doing work out away in the field. I'm here in this hot, sweaty summer in Baton Rouge, not off in the field where it would be nicer to be. Most of the work goes on here in the lab. And so the work that we actually do in our lab is to collect these animals from various places in the ocean, generate different types of DNA sequence information from them. And then from that those DNA sequences, using different types of analyses, we can do things like estimate past population sizes of those animals, how much connectivity there is between populations, how much movement there is between populations, and even infer whether there's been natural selection acting on particular genes that might lie reproduction or immunity or things like that. So we spend a lot of time doing these genetic manipulations of our samples. But more and more, what you do in many biological labs is spend time analyzing those data on the computer. When I was first starting out as a scientist, I'd say I would spend 80% of my time generating the genetic data and maybe 15% of my time analyzing it. That's completely reversed around now. Now, for around $1,000, you can get more DNA sequence data than will fit on an individual hard drive. And so no matter how smart and hardworking you are, there's no way to analyze those data and see what's going on with them without the help of computers. So if you have any interest in computation, there's a ton of opportunities in biology right now. Then the other things you do aside from the research itself is you have to talk about your research, and often that involves getting to go off and talk in exciting places like Hong Kong. And then there's things you do educationally as far as, aside from getting up in front of graduate and undergraduate classes. We also do outreach projects, and this is with some stuff that we do using scope on a rope, which some of you may have seen in classes around Baton Rouge. Okay, so that's one of my hats, is sort of the research teaching professor type hat. The other hat that I wear within the department is that I direct a program of graduate studies. So what I'm going to talk about the rest of the time is sort of the process of applying for graduate school, how that process works, and what the people who are reading your application are looking for. And I'll start off by just sort of telling you what your different options in terms of what graduate degrees are and why you might want to go for one or the other. So the big thing about graduate studies and how they differ from what you're doing now as an undergraduate is that as an undergraduate, essentially, you're just hoovering information that's being spoon-fed to you, that's been distilled into these big textbooks by people who, by and large, are either sort of figureheads that don't write the books or people that have just been reading other books besides. They're not usually the people that are actually out generating new knowledge. And so at this point, the process has been sort of one way, where there's like knowledge and there's you as a target, and it just gets dumped that way. In graduate student, though, I mean, ultimately, though, that knowledge had to be generated by someone. Someone had to go out and find out these things about how the world works. And so that's what graduate school is really about. It's about learning how that process of generating new knowledge works, so that you master a particular field and you learn how to identify questions that are answerable, that are big enough to be important, but small enough to be answerable. And that's essentially what the process is about. So there are classes sometimes, but that's not the emphasis. I mean, there's just a little bit of background you need to jump on and actually do things. The two types of degrees you can go for, one would be a master's degree, usually a 2-year, often a 3-year, though, type of a degree where you get this initial exposure to research. It's still maybe a little bit more class heavy, but you'll learn to work with reading the primary literature, that is where things are first go from someone finding stuff to first reporting it to the scientific community. At the end of this process, you're not really going to be in a position to supervise scientific work, but you'll be a lot more initiated in how research works, so that if you were applying for, say, laboratory technician positions and things like that, people understand that you know a lot more about the process than a typical undergraduate would. A PhD, on the other hand, is going to take a lot longer. In our department, the average ends up being right around 6 years, and it varies a lot among different fields and among different labs. And so in this degree, you really are learning how to direct scientific research. And so it's going to take a lot longer, and it's certainly going to involve at least some finished product where you yourself are the primary author on publications coming out in the primary literature. You can start, despite what people, including some administrators, seem to believe, you actually can start PhDs without a master's. It's really more a question of whether you have a picture of where you want to go. If you really aren't sure if graduate studies are for you, or with a typical field is for you, or where you want to go, a master's degree might be a good start. But if you're really on fire about things and you really think you know what you want to do, then you can go straight into a PhD program and potentially get at more exciting stuff and get your degree over earlier. And so again, the ultimate thing is that really a PhD is essentially born out of ancient European guilds, where, you know, if you're going to be a carpenter, you couldn't just go out and start nailing things to a house. You apprenticed under another carpenter, and that person at some point said, yep, he's a carpenter. And you sort of are, now you're officially a card-carrying carpenter. It's the same thing with a PhD. A PhD is essentially a license to create other PhDs. And that's one that we just don't want to hand out to anyone willy-nilly, so you can sort of walk up and down the street like, get out of the back of Rolling Stone, you're officially Dr. So-and-so. You actually want to have it mean something, that you have someone who's apprenticed under someone else who has sort of met the sort of seal of approval and can now grant PhDs themselves. Okay, so it's, again, a big change from what you do as an undergraduate. You're not really a student. You really should be sort of seen as an apprentice scientist. And that means ideally, in most situations, you're going to have an advisor who's essentially trying to create a peer in you, not something where it's going to sort of stay at this professor-student kind of relationship, but something where you're going to work up to be colleagues. Again, the coursework is secondary. You're expected to do well in it. A C in graduate school is a very, very, very bad thing. A B is sort of eh. So you keep your grades up, but that's not really where your emphasis lies. It's in the research. And so, again, that's one of the few things I'll put in red letters. It's really about learning how to do the research. And so that's a good and a bad thing. There are lots of people that are highly skilled at the classroom grind. They can be working their iPhone, totally ignoring things, sucking in the information in their subconscious and get straight A's. But that's just a process they've learned, something they're good at from the time they were in 3rd or 4th grade. Those people don't necessarily succeed in graduate school. And some of the best scientists out there didn't necessarily have a great time with doing grades. They're kind of different skills. I mean, at some level, your overall enthusiasm for a topic tends to reflect in both these things, but these still are different skills. And ultimately, nobody spends their time asking about what my high school grades were at this point in time. They look at your research productivity, the things you've been able to find, the papers you've been able to publish. That's really where it's all headed ultimately. So what is it you actually do when you're in graduate school? Well, you may be performing experiments or collecting samples the way that students in my labs do, and you're generating data. You'll be reading through the scientific literature. So if you're going to be creating new information, you have to have some idea of what people already know and understand. So, and that's changing all the time. There's usually especially hot topics where people are learning things very quickly, and you should stay up to date on those things because getting to something second is usually not going to get you a whole lot of attention or credit. Ultimately, you're going to be writing papers. That's the final currency of science, is to get the stuff out and published. The idea of a mad scientist sitting in their basement, sort of autistic and staring at test tubes, is a real kind of, it's just a terrible model for how science actually works. It's very social, and really science, science without communication, science without publications is essentially sex without a partner. It doesn't really matter. It's not the same thing. You're just fooling yourself. Ultimately, you've got to get the information out to other people to get credit for it, and so it stays in the literature and stays out there for the whole public to find. Yeah, question. I'm not equating the fun of the two things, but the idea that there's fundamentally a process that involves more than one person and communicating with the larger world. And I think it's also something I really can't overemphasize, is there's a lot of people who find out really interesting things in the lab and do really interesting things that are terrible at communicating those findings, either in spoken word or writing them down. And people that are good communicators that write well, are compelling speakers, get more credit for the same kind of findings than people that aren't. So communication is an important part of the scientific process. Yes, I understood what you said. Okay, so what do we got to do here? Oh, and you have to learn how to present things then. Again, talking about your own data in a laboratory meeting or at a department meeting, but also at national and international meetings. And then others work, you may be summarizing. You have to learn how to read the primary literature and summarize it for other people. There may be journal club meetings in your department. And then you're also doing this in terms of teaching. A big thing that we talk about is, see one, do one, teach one, as far as you really help solidify the basics that you may have learned as an undergraduate when you yourself have to get up in front of people and teach those things to them. So really teaching for graduate students is a big part, and even for professors, is a big part, sort of a capstone on the learning process. Okay, so what's a typical day look like? You might come in and start some experiments. Depending on those kinds of experiments, they may be things that take several hours and you run continuously, or you may start something one day that has to run for a few days, or what have you. And then during that time, while these experiments are running, you're catching up on the literature. That's something that you can do by now. Something you might want to start doing now is you can get free tables of contents delivered to you from journals of specialties around you, so you can skim those quickly, see what the new papers are coming out, potentially read things that are attractive to you. You're thinking about where to go next based on what you've been finding in the lab, so designing your next experiments. You're attending departmental seminars. So there's things going on in our department, at least 2 or 3 seminars a week where outside speakers come from other institutions, and you get to see their seminars. You can also set up face-to-face talk to them to sort of talk about the details of things. You're going to classes as you need to, and then you have oftentimes teaching assignments. And then part of this talking process, again, part of the communication process is that you need to start finding colleagues that do think about the same kinds of things that you think about. And they may be in your lab. Certainly your advisor is very important, but they may be other graduate students that are around campus, wherever you are. But also there may be people that you've met at national or international meetings that you want to run something by, or that you're thinking of collaborating with. And so this kind of communication, again, sharing your ideas with other people, getting their feedback to sort of enhance your own creativity and your own efficiency is an important part of success in science. Oh yeah, and so I should have said, so a big thing about that then is multitasking. That nothing that we do is especially hard, but juggling all these balls at once can get to be difficult. Okay, as far as life outside the lab, how that's different from being an undergraduate, no one should come out of graduate school in any kind of debt. You should be getting the kind of support that you need to break even. No one should take out a loan to go to graduate school. In any graduate school, it says the degree is worth so much that you should have to pay X, Y for it. That's bullshit, okay? You get money, you get $30,000 a year to go to Harvard, so I don't know what the University of Phoenix is doing for you. Don't pay for graduate school, okay? So they should be giving you money either to work in the lab directly or to work as a teaching assistant. And again, both these things are things that if you're enthusiastic about the topic, you want to do these things anyway. So now you're finally getting money to do things that you want to do anyway. So that's a new thing in life. And it's enough money, again, you can live comfortably. I mean, you know, I generally, I had a roommate about half the time in graduate school, but I still got to travel a few places, and I ate well. It was okay. Some people even have a family life. Again, it varies, again, on how efficient you can be with your time. But there are graduate students, even successful ones, that have spouses, that even have children. And so that's something that's probably easier to pull off in graduate school, where you're more in control of your schedule than when you have so many classes as an undergraduate. And you can't have hobbies outside of your research. Again, one of my hobbies was that I went scuba diving, but I did also, again, kept on traveling and doing other things. And again, your time is more your own. In most laboratories, it's about getting things done, not necessarily about showing your face at certain times. And so you can tend to juggle a wider variety of things in your life than you can when all your class schedules are set by someone in the registrar's office. Okay, so research and figuring out how it all works when you get to graduate school. When you go to graduate school, depending on the kind of, in biology, depending on sort of the field and its own cultural traditions, and sometimes you'll start off what are called doing rotations, which are awfully similar in some ways to what you're probably doing with research this summer. You might have a project of about 4 to 6 weeks where you sort of get the hang of what a particular lab is like, what your lab mates in that lab would be like, what the projects are like, what the kind of science they work on is like, how the advisor actually works with his or her students. In other times, in other fields, the tradition is more that you're accepted directly into a particular lab. So in what I do, more evolutionary biology, evolutionary genetics, you generally are already assuming that you're going to be working with one particular person when you're admitted to graduate school. That advisor is really, really key. By the time that you finish graduate school, let's say you finish undergrad at 23, you finish a PhD in 6 years. So by the time you're 29, you probably will have had you'll probably have a longer, more face-to-face interactions with your advisor than any other adult besides your parents by the time you finish graduate school. But unlike your parents, you get to choose this person. So in some ways, how you choose your advisor is analogous, not in a creepy kind of way, to the dating process. In that it's really important that there's a good match between the advisor and the advisee. Just like that all of you may know somebody over here and somebody over here. They're both great in their own way, but they just don't work together. That can be true of advisors as well. There are advisors that want to have the lights on in the lab at 7:30 and off at 6 and want to see your body there all the time and will tell you exactly what you're supposed to be doing every second of the day. And some people want that. There are other people that never look in on them, will never ask a question about what you're doing, even if you're sinking deeper and deeper into the mud and suffocating. And again, some people like that. They have the discipline to work for themselves. But you've got to be honest. So again, just like the dating process, you have to be honest about what your qualities are. Do you need someone to crack the whip over your head, or are you truly self-disciplined? Are you someone that will go and ask for help when you need it, or do you need to have someone who sort of taps on your shoulder and checks to make sure that you're keeping up with things? And so these are things that you sort of, in some ways you find out by talking to the advisor. Oftentimes you get sort of by osmosis or by talking to other people who've been in that person's lab to sort of get a feel for, is this person kind of like me? Would I be happy the way this person's happy or not? And any advisor who doesn't give you the chance to talk to their students is someone to avoid. And also another thing that varies a lot from lab to lab is that in some labs you very much have a particular project prescribed, often because it's some kind of sub-aim or something like that of a grant that's already been funded. So in that sense, your PhD becomes almost like a contract. You're going to work on this section of things, and certain things may come up that makes things change, but in some ways you have less creative say over what you're going to be working on for 5 or 6 years. In other labs, you may have absolute creative say, even to an extreme point where someone may let you sort of fly off on something that's virtually hopeless and you end up in a hole. So again, there's all kinds of things on that continuum that sometimes you really you have a particular thing that's been burning a hole in your head since you were 13 years old that you have to work on. then you don't want to go to a lab where just because they have money, they're going to tell you what to do. And so oftentimes there is this kind of trade-off between the amount of creative say that you have and the amount of kind of financial security that the lab can offer. So again, you're in charge. You've got to be self-disciplined. Your projects can fail. They can be bad ideas. And you've got to sort of be able to spot when that's the case. And ultimately, though, you're striving for publishable results. And usually, if you've never published something, understanding what those are can be learning to do that can be a slow and painful process. But again, the ultimate idea is that you're going to be turning into an independent scientist. That is someone who can find a question that's interesting enough, it's broad and important enough to be interesting, but specific enough that you can make significant progress on it. Okay, you can also say, you can always say, I want to understand how the Earth was formed, but the idea that you can finish off a significant answer towards that in 5 years as one person is probably a little unrealistic. So there's sort of an art then to choosing something that's big enough to be important, but small enough to be doable. Okay, so to ensure success, the number one thing that I look for in graduate students is enthusiasm. I can teach you anything. Anybody who's enthusiastic and hardworking, I can teach them anything. But I can't take somebody who's really, really smart and knows they're really, really smart, but doesn't care. So enthusiasm is something that you can inspire it, but you can't teach it. And so that's the number one thing that I personally look for in graduate students, because without that, the rest of it is a waste of time. And so what that means then is the possibility of potentially having to work hard. Again, this is something that varies among labs. Some labs are very 9 to 5. A very successful guy that I know only did 9 to 5, never came in. He had a job at the Pennington, got a much bigger job out in Utah, and he only works 9 to 5, always has. But during that 9 to 5, I mean, he doesn't check email, he doesn't answer the phone. He works hard and extremely focused for 8 hours. Other people like to sort of futz around. It's kind of a lifestyle thing. They may be spending a lot more time in lab. And also there has to be flexibility. Certain times there's 3-day experiments. If you start a 3-day experiment on Thursday, you don't tell the organism that you'll be back on Monday. Okay? It's a 3-day experiment. You come and you finish it. So a lot about those hours is about you, again, having the organization skills, the drive, and the flexibility to make things happen, not necessarily on a 9 to 5 schedule. And again, perseverance will come out of that enthusiasm that you actually care about the answers, want to see things through. And again, this effective communication, the idea that the same kind of science in different people's hands will get them different points in terms of how clearly you can write or how clearly you can compel that a certain question is important and deserves funding. These are really, really important things. And I think they're underestimated, the importance of communication, both written and spoken, in scientific success. And then finally, you want to have a supportive lab environment. So that means not just the advisor themselves, but you have lab mates that don't make your skin crawl when you spend, I mean, again, you're spending all this time in the same places then. If you hate these people and you just deceive the whole time you're at work, that's not happy. You're not going to be productive. So again, you've got to be honest about what you can take and what you look for in people. And it's nice to have a larger group as well, just to sort of, I mean, life doesn't always go smoothly. It's nice to have sort of a support group around of people that understand what your situation is and help you out with that. Okay, so it's typical timeline. You're figuring out what you want to do and what lab you're going to be in during your first year, taking some courses during that time, finishing up your coursework in the second year. For the third year, you take a general exam. Basically, this is the last big exam you ever have to take, sort of a written and spoken kind of shakedown on whether you know your field well enough to actually start to become a researcher there. And hopefully by the time you take that, it shouldn't be such a scary deal, but it's kind of it's a landmark thing because generally once you're past that, it's all down to the research. And so this is always the good thing is that you don't have any more big hurdles to jump after that general exam. The bad thing is that without those signposts, it's very difficult for people to understand whether they're making adequate progress or not. And really what they should be thinking about is, am I getting towards publishable papers? This says 2. If you really want to go on and have jobs, it's going to be a lot more than 2 papers, and that takes a whole lot of work and, again, a lot of multitasking. And then finally, you should be getting out in around 6 years, writing up dissertations. But generally, depending on what you want to go on and do, you might be looking for opportunities for what comes after as well. Okay, so given that this is actually for you, what is it we're actually looking for in our graduate program? So first off, you want to have somebody that has basically the academic essentials that they'll be able to complete the work. And so there's some people that because of their background or just their aptitudes, it's not going to work out for them. So that's just sort of the level at which we sort of screen GPAs and GRE scores. This is basically, have you had enough moderately decent academic success that you're up for this? You'll be able to physically do the work. Then I sort of have this this sort of fits in with the enthusiasm thing I talked about, is that there's certain students that are exciting to have around. There's people that like already have been going off to Central America or to West Africa to organizing these field collection trips or whatever it is, and then love to tell people about it in slideshows. They just make being around exciting, and so those are nice people to have. And so generally those people, for enhancing the research, it may be something where as an undergraduate they already learned how to do some special skill that the lab would like to add. That makes them attractive. You'd like to think that there's people that are good citizens for the program, so that one of the most embarrassing things I can remember is a past colleague, no longer on our faculty, but who just gave a tremendously bad talk at a meeting one time. And he had just switched here from another place. And I remember thinking, oh, thank God, at least he hasn't said he's from LSU. And then the last thing he said was, oh, and I'm from LSU if you need to find me. And I was just mortified. And I would hate to think that's the same thing with our students. I would like to think that the flip side is true for our students. I want to think that when people see our students up there and they say they're from LSU, that they think, wow, they really turn out some great students from there. I mean, you really want to take pride in that. They're essentially your academic children, and you want to be proud of them. And then again, things that increase the program's diversity. This is especially true in our department, like so many, where just a look at our graduate students does not look like the typical, really even the typical undergraduate class, let alone the citizens of Louisiana. That's something that we should be embarrassed about, and we're taking strides to improve. So what is it we're looking for then? You can basically have decent GPA and standardized tests. So again, you have these academic qualifications just that you're going to succeed. That you're enthusiastic, but not blindly so. I mean, there's people that, again, like, I want to understand how species form, like, and everything in the world interests them so much that they're essentially ADD 120 hours a day. And that's, I mean, enthusiasm is great, but at some point you have to settle on one thing and focus. So just constant rambling off at the mouth enthusiasm can get to be too much, but just shy of that is awesome. Again, a good match with the program and the faculty. We see this a number of times where we have highly qualified people that haven't really thought about their match, which lab they would work in, or whether, for example, there's a lot of inquiries that we get that want to do work on human subjects and things like that. And we don't have any of our faculty that actually work on human subjects. So we really haven't got a spot for those people in the program. And so there's, they're not going to be happy here ultimately, so they don't get admitted. And then oftentimes, and this is something a lot of students neglect, oftentimes departments really do look to see that students have at least communicated with one or two professors who would be interested potentially in taking them in. We used to just admit students that looked really good on paper, and they would get here and they were good, but there was really no match for them. And that's really going to be a dissatisfying thing for both the student and a frustrating thing for our program, that we admitted someone, support them, and they don't really have a place where they want to go where they're going to be happy. So that match is really important. And again, that involves, sometimes there's rotations where you might want to know where there's a couple people you might match with. So how do you get this all working? One is, the big thing is just to do your homework, and the way you do that anymore is just to get on the web and start typing away. So I would suggest, if you have a general topic that you're interested in, if you've ever done research in a lab, there's people you can talk to about programs or people they might be interested in, or if you can even just type in something that's exactly like what you think you want to do and see if there's a scientific paper that comes up that covered something like that using Google Scholar or something, and then find out where that person is, enter their name, go to their lab website. Everybody has a lab website these days, and you can get some kind of flavor about what labs do, how energetic they are, how enthusiastic they are about new students just by looking at those things. If you find that Mr. or Ms. Dr. Wright, at some point it's a scary thing, but you really should contact them directly. The best way to do that is by an email that tells you enough about yourself to let them know that you're serious, you've actually thought about them, but not sort of so much, not pages and pages of stuff droning on about your whole life from the time you were 5 years old. So you just want to introduce yourself. I'm so-and-so. I'm really interested in so-and-so. I really am interested in your lab in particular because of your work on X, Y, and Z. And what I would like to do is, R. So then tell us if you've had any research experience, for example, what you're having right now, what upper division courses you had and how those might have inspired you, and then ask whether they're accepting new students for next fall or for whenever it is. And again, I think it's important that you've done your homework here. For the most part, professors end up doing research on a relatively small part of the world. And a student that writes who's genuinely interested in that relatively small part of the world, that should be a really, really flattering thing. And that should catch their attention, and they should respond positively to you. On the flip side of that, if you're just trolling everywhere, that's a real turnoff. You're just wasting my time. And an example of that, my wife is also a professor in the department. She works on plasticity. Oh gosh, what does she do again? Cellular communication in the retina in chickens. And so she's a neurobiologist, couldn't be farther away from what I do. And we occasionally get the same inquiries from students. I mean, generally not American students, but still. And it's something where it's obvious, it's so nonspecific. I've always wanted to do the work that's been in your lab. Do you have any opportunities coming up for next fall? The work that's in your lab, I mean, it couldn't say less. And so you don't want to have that. You want to name names. You know, if there's a paper of theirs that you read that was exciting, or you read about something, prospective projects that they're working on that you think is really cool, say so. I mean, those kinds of particulars really, really resonate with the people you're writing to. How do you get paid through graduate school? Again, you shouldn't be taking out loans. There should be money for you to go to graduate school. At one level, there's teaching assistantships. All of our students, for example, are guaranteed 6 years of teaching assistantships if they come in on the PhD. But that's good up to a point in that it solidifies your background in the field and you get a chance to learn how to teach. However, it does take away from research time. So ideally, you might have a lab where they offer research assistantships, which is essentially where the professor has money to support his or her own research and can help pay you to do some of that research, often which is part of your project anyway. So you're essentially getting paid to do the stuff you have to do anyway. Then there's other kinds of things which are really nice about different kinds of fellowships that you can apply either from particular universities. They may be open or they may be targeted towards particular subsets of the population to increase diversity, or because somebody had a nephew that was always interested in birds and they left a scholarship for it. You never know what it is. And then there's some very often very competitive ones nationally, like from the National Science Foundation. Very competitive, but very, very prestigious and give you a lot of freedom and a decent amount of money. So nice things to look into. Just to give you an idea of how much money these things are, the master's degree generally pay less. And again, I hate to compare to the Southern average, but it's what everyone has to do around here. LSU is not especially generous with their stipends, thanks to priorities set by our government. But we are close to the average for this area. And again, you can hobble through on this much money with at least not going into debt. Our PhD students make around $20,000 a year. And then a number of people are on fellowships that make a little bit more than that. And some individual professors augment these with a couple $1,000s more than that. So again, if you're living with roommates and don't drive a Ferrari, you can get through grad school without going into debt. And these things also, they include usually some or all of the tuition and also your health insurance. So they're cutting out a lot of the expenses that you would have as somebody who's working in the workplace to sort of give a fair comparison for those stipends, salaries. So what actually goes into applying for graduate school? What are the things they're going to want to take a look at? One's going to be your transcripts from any and all places where you've been. Another is going to be the graduate record exam, the GREs. We just care about looking at math and verbal scores. There are some places that would want to see a biology score as well. We don't ask for that, but there are some schools that will. Another thing that's really important then are letters of recommendation. And this is especially important for assessing whether a student is really serious about going to graduate school. I mean, if you were going to go off and say, I want to be a professional basketball player, it's like, well, I've never actually played, I've just watched on TV. That's not a very compelling kind of background. And in some ways, that's what graduate school is like for some people. They really just sat in classes and watched biology or watched science happen, but you're not going to be doing that a whole lot in graduate school. It's about doing and about succeeding at doing. So having a letter from a professor, especially, who's been a firsthand witness to you actually working in the lab and whether you're good at it, whether you enjoy it, whether you stick to things and get things done, that can be a really, really compelling part of your application. So you should sort of make it a point during your last years of your undergraduate time to try to get at least one letter like that, and hopefully, other letters from maybe smaller classes where professors know you as a human and not as, by your alphabetical listing as the person who finished, 32nd in a class of 97. So those personal accounts mean a lot in the applications. And then you're going to have a research statement where, again, you're sort of saying why it is you want to go to graduate school, what your ultimate goals are, and why you think the program you're applying to can help you meet those goals. So as far as what that essay goes into, well, since you're going into the graduate school and that's mainly about research, you want to emphasize your research experiences, what you've done, what you've learned from those things, how they have encouraged you to follow the path you now want to follow. So you, again, want to make sure that your essay is non-generic. Just like with that initial email, a number of the essays that we get could be written to any program, and sometimes I think they don't even necessarily have to be written to a biology program. They're really not talking about the person and their particular experiences. They're so broad that they nearly say nothing. You want to have things that say things about you as a person. What particular events got you on the path that you're on now? And to the extent possible, pulling out a couple of detailed anecdotes, not long, but with real personal details that set you apart from the crowd. So again, with those things relevant to your field of study, I mean, you don't have to go through your whole kind of psychological diagnosis and how somebody looked at you funny in third grade and now you've been afraid and live in the lab. You want to balance what it is that you have done already with what it is you want to do. There are sometimes people that spend the whole essay talking about what they want to do, but don't have anything listing about their past experiences. There's other people that go into ad nauseum details about a project that they did on the side, but don't tell us anything about what they want to do next in graduate school. So you want to have a balance between those things. I did this, I learned this, and my next thing I want to do is this. Okay, and this is how that would fit with your program. And then again, make that essay fit the program. So you want to make sure you get across then what it is you want to do in terms of career objectives, if not so much those, certainly thinking about why you're into this particular field of interest. And if you can, you want to sort of show off your biological taste. If you've actually gotten to the point where you think you've come across something that's really worth looking at, but you're sort of surprised that no one's really gone into it in detail, show that off. I mean, that should be something that people are looking for. If you think you've got an idea you want to go after and you think it's worth pursuing, make sure that comes out in that essay. And then ultimately, why it is you want to do what you want to do. And again, if you have personalized anecdotes that you used to always go down to Grand Island, go crabbing, and then you notice that that certain times of the year the crabs wouldn't go after your toes, and so their aggression was changing, and you want to know why. Okay, something like that. I mean, just some kind of story that motivated your interest in biology or in the particular thing that you want to go after. Okay. Yeah, and you might even want to, okay, right. This is an important thing about when you talk about undergraduate experiences like the one you're having now. I'll try to slow down because this actually is the most relevant thing I'll probably tell you since you're all going through an undergraduate research program right now, is that oftentimes when we see these essays, it's pretty clear that students can't actually describe what they did and why. And so you should have some kind of idea. I mean, why did you do what you did? I mean, don't say, I added this reagent to these treatments and saw this. I mean, why would you add that reagent? I mean, back it up a little bit so yes, there might be particulars about what you did, but what was the motivation for why you did the project that you did? Briefly, what you did in terms of technique-wise, if it was interesting, and then what the results showed and what conclusions you could draw from that. Just sort of show us that you have an understanding of what you were doing and why, as opposed to just sort of a listing. I worked for Dr. So-and-so, and we threw a bunch of salts at some crabs, and he wrote me a letter. That's not very exciting or compelling. Try to go deeper than that. Okay, so then just sort of the basics, the mechanics then of applying. You should be thinking right about now about places to apply. I mean, I really would, certainly if there's anything about the labs where you're working right now that is interesting, you could be asking advice of graduate students or postdocs or the advisor there to give you advice about places to look and labs to look at. Start thinking about that personal statement and drafting basic ideas and outlines for that right about now. And then be looking at things like departmental programs, but also for many fields, you really want to look at particular labs. And so the best way to do that, again, is just start with sort of topics. If you just sort of, if it said, marine speciation lab or whatever, you do that, and, after 20 pages, I'll be on there. And the same thing would be true for lots of other topics that people have their own lab websites, especially the ones that are actively looking for new students. So right about this time of the year, then, you want to be meeting with faculty members to talk about your first personal statement. And that can be faculty members, but again, that could potentially be senior graduate students or postdocs as well. You want to be thinking about who might be writing your letters of recommendation. And it's generally considered a courtesy to give people certainly the first time they're going to write you a letter, I would say at least 4 weeks. They won't do it until 3 days beforehand for the most part, but it's just part of what you're supposed to be doing. So ask a little bit early just to let people know. And then people, when you're going to write them a letter, will generally want to see a copy of your transcripts, maybe a copy of that statement that you're writing, some idea of where it is you're going to be going. And then you want to be signing up for the standardized tests if you haven't taken them yet, and look at the places you want to apply so you understand when their applications are due. About October, then you'd be taking the GRE. Maybe you want to do that earlier so you can retake it in case things don't go well. Figure out which schools you're going to be applying for, and make sure you've got all the application materials. Again, almost all the stuff is online now. There's usually not materials you have to request anymore. Keep on working on that personal statement. But one thing you do have to request is you have to request that all transcripts from any place where you've been to school are going to get mailed, and that actually can be a hassle. So that's one thing you actually have to ask for from other people. Then during November, you think about then, complete all the parts of the application process, at least in rough form. So you got it done, but you can sort of sit back and look at them for a while. Make sure the recommenders have all your information by now. I probably would have done that a little bit earlier. Double check your deadlines to make sure you're not going to miss anything. And then usually those deadlines fall somewhere right around the Christmas, New Year's kind of range. I think we're December 15th this year. Lots of places are between that December 15th, January 1st kind of idea. But the idea you can get this all done as soon as you're done with finals by having taken a few steps earlier is a good idea. Okay, and then what's you'll usually there'll be offers going out. I would say even earlier now, more like February, from graduate schools for interviews. And interviews for graduate school are generally different from what they are for med schools. And for the most part, if a graduate school wants to interview you and is paying to fly you out, they pay to fly you out. They pay for you to stay. And it's really more of a recruiting trip. It's really, generally speaking, they are doing that for their top candidates. And they're trying to sort of woo you by showing you how much fun they are and how much you'd learn there, and often exposing you to the other students that would be your colleagues, so you get a chance to see what that experience would be like. So again, that's just repeating what I just said there. And so that's also a chance then for you to meet people. It's one thing to make impressions about labs and advisors and things like that over the over email and with websites. It's another thing to talk to people face to face and sort of get a feel for them. And that's what you should be doing at the interview. And then usually the offers go out sometime then in late March or mid-March, and there's an April 15th deadline usually for making decisions as far as which place you're going to go. And I think that's all I've got. So I'd be happy to take any questions that you've got. Probably not about my work. I'll be happy to hear about those. But anything about the either why go to graduate school or anything about the application process. Thanks. But wait for that. With the microphone? I'll just repeat the question. Okay, yeah?
If you're watching your junior year this year, and you just application, they'll hold a spot for you when you graduate.
Yeah, so the question was, if you're just starting your junior year now instead of your senior year, will they hold a spot for you? No, I wouldn't do that. I think that I've never been exposed to anything like that. And the thing is, at this point, with doing research and with learning things, you're learning things. I would imagine that you're learning things so much that you're probably going to become more sophisticated. And you might have, you may have a change in focus, but even if you don't have a change in focus, all the things that you would be part of your application process would be much stronger in a year. So, if you do have that kind of focus and you've already found a lab where either over the summer or during the year you can start doing work, there's nothing more impressive, and you only rarely see it, of students that genuinely have gone through the research process and actually have a first authored paper, not just somewhere in the middle, but really something that's their research that's been published as an undergrad. That's the gold standard. That's the kind of stuff that, that can potentially get you those NSF fellowships and that has labs beating each other with a club to get you. So, that's where I would be putting my energy if you're in that situation.
Let's give the folks in New Orleans a chance at the bottom of there.
Is there somebody down there, New Orleans?
Any questions from New Orleans? Just speak up. Wave at us so at least we know you're awake. Thank you. Shreveport. Second round. Any questions? Just speak up. All right. I guess we go back to our room.
Anybody else here? Yes. So the question is whether there's a typical number of graduate programs to apply to. I guess I'm thinking in my head 3 to 5 or something like that. But I just, yeah, I think that just sort of seems reasonable to me somehow. Just because, you know, there is a lot about the match for advisors. So even a lab that looks really where you want to go somehow might not be all that when you get there. And then the other thing is there's a matter of timing. I missed out on a student who's had fantastic success because my lab was kind of full and there really wasn't funding for him when he came up. And he even got to interview and I was like, why did they even fly him out? This is just painful. I'm just sort of seeing what I'm missing. And so there's things where really there's things that are really beyond the control of the professor or you where it's just not going to work. And so if you only were looking at that one place because it was so perfect, then you'd sort of be left high and dry for a bit. So just because you don't know how those interviews are going to work out and just because you don't know how timing works out with programs or with funding in particular labs, I would say that 3 to 5 is sort of a good number to look at. Yeah. The questions about the MD PhD programs, and I'm glad you asked it. I didn't know where I could have fit that in there, but I think that's something for people that are either on the fence about whether they want to get an MD or a PhD, or for people that think they want to do research but really have strong clinical interests. I would really encourage it. The other reason I really encourage it is because an MD PhD is another way to come out of grad school / medical school not in debt. And I cannot emphasize to you how important it is to avoid debt. You may come through medical school and after that experience decide that you want to work in public health in rural Botswana, and you won't have that option because you can't explain to a bank that I've had a spiritual calling and I want to go do something that makes use of my skills in a way that will make me almost no money. And they'll say, TS, man, you owe us 250 large. Get back to us now, you know? And so you are constrained to a particular lifestyle where you make a particular amount of money because you owe somebody money. And that's non-negotiable unless you just renounce your citizenship and go on the lam. Whereas if you come out of with an MD PhD program, you spend more time. You're paying it with time up front. And that time seems a lot to people your age right now. But to an old man like me, an extra 2 or 3 years, God, it doesn't matter at all. And the idea that in those 2 or 3 years you come out debt-free, that you pay with your time now to come out with absolute freedom to do whatever you want. If you get called more to the research, you leave the MD behind. It's just another mark on your card. That's fine. If you want to leave the research, you're a real MD. You can go off to a residency like anybody else. And if that residency fails or if things start to go south, you've got backup. I mean, you've got other skills and you don't have to owe things to anybody during the time that you're finding yourself. So I think that's an excellent idea for people, and I think it's sort of underappreciated. Now, I think it's something that is probably more appreciated now than it was 5 or 6 years ago. So those programs are, generally speaking, more competitive than a straight MD or a straight PhD. But usually they do have a stipend of like 25 or 30, better than most graduate schools around. And to compare that to, again, when I say I had 250K for med school, that's probably me and my old thinking. It's probably more like 400 now, and that's that's serious money. And so that's worth it for certain people that really know where they want to head. But for keeping doors open, which I just think is a fantastic thing for life in general, I think MD, PhD programs for people who have those interests are a really, really good thing to look into. Yep.
Anybody else?
Any other questions?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.